Evolutionary Underground episode 50 is coming your way. Today we're going to talk about how to run Primobolan and Anavar for the Golden Age look by Geneza Pharma. So in this one, look, we're going to go over what does Golden Age mean in bodybuilding. There's a lot of debate out there. Some people think it means this, some people think it means that. And look, at the end of the day, we're going to kind of give our opinions on what that means. A lot of people don't even know what Golden Age refers to. So we're going to go over that. We're going to talk about why the Primo Anavar stack is relevant today and the way it's kind of gained back popularity. And we're going to go over that. We're going to talk about what to expect from this combination, how to cycle the stack, and we're going to talk about Geneza Pharma quality, where you can get your Primo and Anavar. But first, let me remind everybody, we are on Apple, we are on Spotify. Go ahead and like, subscribe, comment, give us ratings, all that good stuff. That helps the algorithms pick us up, and it helps keep our podcast going. As you can probably know, you probably found our podcast some way through an algorithm, or you found our podcast through the forum. So it's very, very important that others are able to find the podcast as well. The stuff we talk about on this podcast is unlike anything out there. So the algorithms hate us. They hate us. So what you have to do is you have to force those algorithms to pick us up, and that is how you do it. So make sure you like, subscribe, comment, give us ratings, all that good stuff I mentioned, and that helps us out. So let's get into the first topic. And this is a topic that I wanted to kind of pick Mobster's brain on, because he studied bodybuilding for a long time. He grew up in the time where it was the latter stages of the Golden Age era. So why don't you start us off, Mobster? Talk about what Golden Age even means in bodybuilding.
Yeah, Steve said in the pre-show that some people dispute, arguably, and these are the kind of conversations we like to have when we're talking about the history of the sport. Anyway, Steve, when the golden age was, and of course, it's an old man thing, and I say that as an old man to argue about my time being the best time, and we all do that with cars, with art, with music, with whatever. But the argument is somewhat negated, as I said to Steve in the pre-show, because one could argue the reason why we would call, and I'm thinking the mid to late 70s, and perhaps arguably, Steve, creeping into the early 1980s, and it's not as a former professional bodybuilder saying that my condition was better than your condition or any of that shit. It's probably when we become mainstream, when having personalities like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's still a personality, who's still relevant now in his fucking 70s, almost 80 years of age, he's very nearly the same age as my mum. He's still famous. He's still out there. He still talks about bodybuilding. And you needed someone like that. And what you also started to see was what we think of the conditioned bodybuilders started to appear. But more than that, as I said just now, it's that mainstream thing. It's Dave Draper and Arnold and a few others getting into the movies. It's taking bodybuilding to Conan. It's having pumping iron out there and catching people's imagination. And so you go from, I'll give you an example, Steve, and this probably applies a little bit to powerlifting. Bodybuilding competitions were held after the powerlifting had finished, and they were held in basketball courts and the back rooms of gyms and stuff like that. And very rare to see it in big theaters. And again, the golden age was arguably when magazines like Weeder were selling hundreds of thousands of magazines, and these shows started to be held in big theaters with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people attending. When, because of personalities like Arnold, the media become involved and started sending CBS along to film these things, where the early 80s, the beginning of the 90s, you started to see sports shows include bodybuilding and so on and so forth. We'd always been a little bit of a filler at the end of the Pathé newsreels, and 5 minutes at the end of a Saturday night news item might be about a bodybuilding competition. It might get mentioned locally, but when it become national, when it become out there, and when personalities from pumping iron especially become that big of a deal, you started to see conditioned bodybuilders. You started to see people making money, not like $1,000 prize, but tens of thousands of dollars in Arnold's example, from just selling training courses in a way that hadn't been done before. He wasn't a bodybuilding writer. he was a bodybuilder that put a few words together for a training course. Prior to then, you had mail order stuff, but this was different. This was literally my big chest routine, my big arms, and so on. And so this whole stuff catching the imagination. I think also arguably, Steve, you're always going to have the freaks in any sport, the elite of the elite of the elite at any sport. And Arnold is one of those people. But people started to go to the gyms en masse. The percentage of population that goes to the gyms, which is roughly 10% regular exercise, and all kinds of exercise, but including going to the gyms, has been pretty much the same since that time, roughly 10%, 10, 11, 12%. That's 300 to 400 million people in America. That's 30 to 40 million people from that time till now, regardless of the ups and downs of politics, etc. Bodybuilding. Prior to then, it was a tiny fraction, 1, 2, 3%. Now it's 10%, pretty much all the goddamn time. Jogging is fine. Zumba classes are fine. The idea that you exercise at home, buying exercise equipment in Walmart, all that stuff didn't really take off in that particular way in the general population till that time. And then you got the whole bodybuilding magazines on the front and center on the newsstands and on the news and in the movies and all that kind of stuff. So we're not talking about Steve Reeves and Reg Parker's Hercules and spaghetti western type movies and stuff being filmed in Mexico. We're talking about big movie productions and $25 million contract, which is still a big lump of cash for bodybuilders, for people like Sylvester Stallone to be seen doing Planet Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. And it all came from that time. And then arguably, again, just from the physique aspect that we look at as people that listen to this show, the majority of people that listen to this show will arguably be bodybuilders that want to look better and to get into shape. And it's the look, the lean, muscular look. The striations start to appear. What we call cuts started to appear. Prior to that, you could have a big muscular chest, big muscular arms, and if you had a little bit of a waist, you would win in competitions. There was a handful of ripped bodybuilders, but it was very much a thing where people, even Arnold towards the end of his career, not just big and muscular, but separation in the quads. That was never really a thing prior to then. So what we consider the modern look kind of started then.
So let me let you back in a second, but I'll give you my little take on it a little bit. And look, the golden age physiques of the 70s, we're talking tight waist, we're talking hard muscles, focusing on aesthetics more than sheer size that we see today. And I'll give you an example. The Mr. Olympia champions of that era were not that heavy in weight, whether it be Arnold or any of those other guys. And then guys like Samir Bannout, early 80s, he won the Mr. Olympia, what was it, 82 or 83 mobster, or maybe 81. Frank Zane, another guy
82,
too.
83 rings a bell. Chris Dickerson was around that time, yeah.
And all these guys who were finishing, top 3, top 5 in Mr. Olympia, they didn't weigh that much. Samir Bannout, his maximum weight was 195 pounds. Today, we see Mr. Olympia champions who are 300 pounds in the off season. They're absolutely monsters. The Ronnie Colemans, the Jay Cutlers started coming around. And then we started having guys of today, the big Ramis and the Hotties, and those guys who are winning the Mr. Olympias. Now, these guys are huge. I mean, if they got on stage at 195 pounds at the Mr. Olympia, they look at them and be like, well, who's this guy? Who's this midget? Get him off the stage. Who's this skinny guy? Let him go compete in some regional fucking competition, some amateur competition. So the guys in those times, and the big reason, we're going to get into this in the next topic, and the reason why these guys were not huge, was because of the gear they were using. And they loved in that era what we're going to talk about on this podcast, which is the Primobolan, which is the Anavar. Those were their favorite steroids of those times. And that's why we're going to talk about those two steroids from Geneza Pharma. They weren't using what the guys use today. The trend wasn't around. They didn't have access to tons of HGH, tons of insulin, things like equipoise and tons of testosterone. They could not take tons of testosterone, or they would end up with estrogen problems. They had no way to control estrogen back then. They didn't know about anti-estrogen drugs. So things have changed a lot, and they had access to what they had access to. And at that time too, bodybuilding was more of a niche, type of thing. There weren't gyms. Another thing about the golden age, mobster, and This was even more pronounced in other countries, but even in a country like America, which is always innovating, the first to, innovate when it came to, making our lives better and making us more lazy, and making us, you have a desk job, okay, you have a desk job, you're going to get fat. No, you're not going to get fat because after your desk job or before you go into work, you're going to go to something called a gym. And this started coming around in America. Before in America, you had boxing gyms. People would go and they do boxing and they would do cardio and they do jump ropes and stuff like that or hit the bag. And then they started coming up with the concept of gyms. And the golden age ushered in the whole gym thing in America. Now there's a fucking gym on every corner in America. There's a Planet Fitness on every fucking corner. Within a 5 mile radius of where I live, there's probably three Planet Fitnesses. So, so now you have access to gyms all over the place. Why? Because the golden age started the whole gym thing. But in the golden age, you have to be in a big city, New York City, Chicago, LA, San Diego, big cities across America where people were into fitness. Now, even if you're in Kansas or Oklahoma, there are gyms that are available to you. That wasn't the case back then. So, the golden age was kind of the start of 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 everything. It's kind of like the golden age of art, when Michelangelo was painting these amazing things and they ushered in what we see. The artists of today have Michelangelo and those guys of that golden age of art to thank. Well, these Planet Fitness franchise owners that are forking over 1.5 million to open up a franchise, they have the 70s golden age and the 80s, early 80s golden age to thank for that because the whole gym concept was unheard of before the golden age, especially if you were in a small town in America. I can remember going up the first gym that even opened up in my town. I was like in high school when the first gym opened up, and that was in the mid 90s, early 90s. And it was a big deal, man. Like as soon as it opened up, I would ride my bike there, lock up my bike outside and go in. We had basketball court, we had a cardio room, we have a weight room. It was unheard of because the nearest gym was like an hour away. I'd have to go to the big city near me, to even have access to a gym. And this is the first time I had a gym like within a mile of my house. So you can thank the golden age for starting all this shit, Mobster.
Steve just reminded me, and I was just doing this off the top of my head, and I nearly missed one, Steve. Within 5 miles, there are 7 gyms. The one I go to, a new one, which is a chain gym, pure. The local sports centre has a gym. There's a gym at the top of the mountain in Here One or Penwine, and there's another one up Carmarthen. What's that? 6 I can think of. We've had a weightlifting, bodybuilding history in the valley here. In fact, my building backs onto one that was started in 1917. That's another gym. There's the 7, which is the Darien Gym, reopened from the 1917 gym in a new location recently, and the history's been kept going. So that is 7 gyms within a 5 mile radius of where I live. And there's only 50,000 people in this valley, in this section of the valley. So that's 7 gyms for 50,000 people. So absolutely, Steve, Gold's Gym, World's Gym, at the time, in the 80s and 90s, and Planet Fitness around 2000 onwards, these things would not be possible. There is history for weightlifting and bodybuilding going back to the Greek and Roman times, and we've talked about some of that stuff, but there have been peaks and troughs. There have been times when the sport has had princes and kings weightlifting and bodybuilding, and then when that made it popular, and then during the wars, nothing. People didn't have the money during the Depression, forget it. But the 50s onwards, people started to have money, and especially in America. And the idea of using your leisure time to train in some way, to do some kind of sport as leisure and not for your village, but just for yourself and to stay fit because you're not working in an industrial job, kind of took off. And the idea, sometimes we moan about our hard lifestyle, but the fact of the matter is we train because it makes us happy and it costs us money. So literally that is a kind of luxury. And we do this because we enjoy it. And that perception of training for fitness, jogging, cardio, Zumba classes, whatever else, all started from that time. But especially, as I said, when the media grabbed it and you had stuff in the movies and on radios, Arnold being interviewed on the evening news by Barbara Walters, Cosmo, the big name magazines, Time magazine with bodybuilders on the front, all that kind of stuff started from that time. And every single person, probably it's like Elvis, Michael Jackson, Muhammad Ali, Tyson, every single person as a great example. And this applies to those other individuals as well. Arnold Schwarzenegger is in Africa. He's doing some charity thing. They've gone in their cars. They're traveling off into the fucking desert to go to this village in the middle of nowhere. And the person in the car is talking to Arnold, kind of publicity thing, and says, "There must be some place, Arnold, where you're not known." And Arnold kind of laughs with his Arnold-esque type of way. And they go to this place and they decide to stop and get a cold drink. And they get out of these air-conditioned cars and they go to get a Coke, a cola from somewhere. And they go into this fucking bar, this little shack at the side of the road. And on the back of the fucking door, as they walk in, is a picture of Arnold from some movie. So that iconic stuff becomes part of the public consciousness. And it all started not at the beginning of his career, but at the end of his career, which would be 1975 onwards. So yeah, that whole perception and whatever. But also, again, what we consider modern bodybuilding to be probably started from that time as well. So that arguably defines what we could argue the years, but pretty much around that time, that would be arguably the golden age. Even the fact that we get paid more now and Mr. Olympus can get on the evening news for a conversation, it still started from that time. And it's arguably Arnold still actually adds to that with the $500,000 at last year's Arnold and $600,000 by Jake Woods at this year's or the most recent Mr. Olympia competition, end of last year. So the money is bigger, but that's actually, again, off the back of the golden age. The $1,000 prizes went out, and it was Arnold and people like Arnold promoting competitions as well as competing that it started to bring in the tens, the 20s, the hundreds, the 50s, the $500,000, the $600,000 prizes that we see now. And I think Steve's correct, just to finish on that thought process, Steve. Arnold at his absolute best on stage in what people might say was his peak condition at just around 6'2", was 225 pounds. His heaviest, I believe, in the off season was 265. He would barely be a good classic bodybuilder at 225. He would need to be 240 to 250 at 6'2". He would need to be up there with C-Bum, Chris Bumstead, in terms of size. And I believe Chris is around the 240 pounds mark. And I think Chris might actually have him. So yeah, the bodybuilding has moved on, but it moved on from that time. Whether the next golden age, might be able to look back in 20, 30 years and say that now's a golden age remains to be seen until you get the personality that him and others, including Lou Ferrigno, and that kind of grabbing of the public imagination and putting out there into, if we start doing 20% and 30% of the population working it, maybe we'll have a new golden age. But for now, the mid-70s to the early 80s would be the golden age for me. There's great times for Silver Age and Bronze Age and Larry Scott's and people that started bodybuilding and Sandow putting on bodybuilding competitions and all that kind of vibe. But the argument has to be in terms of the physiques and the imagination and the numbers, the percentages, and just the idea of training for fitness of all kinds, arguably started around that time.
So before we move on to the next topic, let me just ask you an question. Besides any of those names that we've talked about, who would be your favorite golden age bodybuilder who doesn't get enough talk based on their looks?
That's a really good question. And I find it hard because what I consider to be a great physique changed from when I started training in 1980. So my initial inspiration would have been, I was training as a bodybuilder when I first started at 15 years of age. So my initial bodybuilder would be Arnold Schwarzenegger. That would be to begin with. Then
besides him, who would it have been?
Yeah, but so a little bit later on would be someone like Bertil Fox with the whole beef it thing, and then of course Dorian Yates.
Okay.
It's hard for me to argue because I think I'm just thinking of the magazines I purchased at that time and who would be the front cover and all that kind of stuff. So now I could look back and see different physiques. But I think my imagination was grabbed there. So it's really difficult. Lou Ferrigno, who I've met at a seminar, is closest to me now physically. 6'5", I'm 6'3", and I've seen him at 320 pounds, hands like fucking shovels. So arguably he would be more my type physically, but at the time, not so much. So who else? Franco maybe, because Franco was stupidly fucking strong. Um, there's been people that could have been Mr. Olympia that had great physiques, but for one reason or another was lacking. You need a great bodybuilder pre-Arnold was Harold Paul. And the problem with Harold Paul, if you look at Harold Paul doing the most muscular, this is late 60s, early 70s. Harold Paul was the kind of, I believe, Hispanic type background. So a lot of Hispanic followers, Mexicans and South Americans, thought he was the bollocks. They really, really, really liked his physique. And if he was flexing at a show, they wanted him to win. The problem was he had a slightly wonky eye, and I mean slightly, just a little thing that probably could have been surgically fixed. But occasionally you could see it in photographs and movie reels. And the other problem was that he had ever such a small, and I mean a small, speech impediment. So he had a wonky eye and a lisp. I've been slightly over the top here. And unfortunately, this fantastic muscular physique that was arguably ahead of his time and as good as Arnold Schwarzenegger and other bodybuilders around that time when Arnold was just trying to make his name, could not come across as well as he should have done in interviews, movie reels, news items, and so on and so forth. You literally got the whole our bodybuilder's gay, and now we've got a bloke with a wonky eye and a list who's the Mr. Olympia. That wouldn't work. Larry Scott, pre that time, looked like a movie star, walked around like a movie star. Steve Reeves, around that time and slightly earlier, looking like what a bodybuilder should look like, a fucking male model with muscles. Reg Park looked like Hercules. And all of these people would be, and again, you're going to the movies and seeing these quote unquote superhero physiques on your fucking screen on your Saturday night movie thing. And you're occasionally getting to see these, and still now I'd see them on the early 3 channel in America, 2 channel here TV programs. So these people look like what we would think of as a superhero now. And if you're young, as I was, 15-year-old, these Hercules, Superman, male model with muscles, when you're 15, 16, 17, it's going to be the absolute thing. So I think for me, I was always impressed by the muscular physique with strength. And Arnold always presented that in a particular, I think, give you an example. Arnold did this thing. You can actually see this, guys, and you can see if I'm talking shit or not. Prior to pumping iron, all of the pictures of Arnold in the gym have him gritting his teeth, veins throbbing on his forehead, tensing his muscles really hard, and looking like a hard training muscular bodybuilder, like we would expect him to. The moment he became consciously aware that he was going to be in the movies, talking in the media, being interviewed for films and so on and so forth, becoming an actor, he would change the expression on his face. He was so self-aware, Steve, that he would have a neutral face. He didn't want training to look hard, so he made it look easy with his face. And he was aware that this picture of his face and physique might appear in the news, might be interviewed, like I said, with Barbara Walters, might start dating one of the Kennedys and so on and so forth. And so he started to present himself in a way. So his awareness of his thing in the world. Prior to that, with the odd exception, Larry Scott was an odd exception, I don't think bodybuilders really give two fucks. They didn't care about the news. They didn't care about the media. They didn't understand anything beyond the fame of being a bodybuilder. But Arnold got the whole Kennedy dating, Marie Shriver, meeting presidents, being a movie star, everything. They tried bodybuilders in the movies like Reg Park and Steve Reeves. And most of their movies are dubbed, not because they couldn't talk, but because their biggest audience was French, Italian, and Spanish. Way less American. So they didn't care at all. Arnold went for language and talking classes. He studied business. He made more money renting property than he's ever made from movies. $200 million from renting properties and leasing properties. So he took that thing that is possible. We talk about making money. You and I have done a show on literally being a professional and making money from this sport. You and I get paid in our way for what we do, but not hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's a pleasure to do these shows and to put this information out there.
Yeah.
Arnold understood that the physique was a way of getting through the door, but once he got through the door, everything else took off. And
Yeah.
the reality of that is it gives back to the rest of us. We understand from Arnold that other things are possible. All things are possible. Fame, etc., etc., etc. So again, arguably, him and other people have made it possible for us and top professional bodybuilders, especially top professional bodybuilders, to make millions of dollars a year. Jay Cutler will be making millions of dollars a year now. Never mind when he was four-time Mr. Olympia. Probably more money now than then. And that was again by thinking like Arnold and being like Arnold. So yeah, I don't think I thought in quite those terms. Then later on, more 1990s, 2000s, more aware, more grown up, more physically capable myself. Then that would change. I like the intellectual side, for example, of Dorian Yates, as well as the hardcore training. Literally going away, looking at the research, looking at the training, looking at Arthur Jones and the Nautilus, doing the least amount possible, and getting maximum muscle stimulus, training your absolute balls off rather than do volume. That's the kind of thing. I'm more into that. So I started to read that kind of stuff. So yeah,
Yeah,
back
yeah,
to you,
cool.
Steve.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the one guy I think that we didn't mention we have to is Sergio Oliva. And if it wasn't for Arnold,
Oh, Steve,
he would have
fucking
won. He would have
freak.
won. Yeah. And then you got to remember in 66 he finished fourth place and then he won three straight 67, 68, 69. In 70, he was second to Arnold. And then in 71, there was that big disqualification thing where they started disqualifying guys for, competing in other competitions. But he got second again in 72. So without Arnold and without Larry Scott, he would have won, five, six, maybe seven Mr. Olympias during that time. So you got to check him out too. And he had a hell of a physique. A lot of people don't give him credit, but he came on before Arnold. He was on there before Arnold, and
Guys, go for the black and white pictures of Sergio when he did a little bit of a stint training with Nautilus. And I believe most of the best pictures, he's almost not flexing properly, Steve. And his arms look bigger than his fucking head. And I believe he's around the late 70s, early 70s, early to mid 70s, when he looks like a freak of a freak of a freak. And above and beyond, aesthetic, no, but he still had a tiny waist. And the only thing was, and I'll say this in the nicest way, that he walked around like a pimp with the gold chains around his neck and the bracelets and stuff. And his shirts and his clothing was cut to fit. So he had the whole pimp vibe going on, although he's actually Cuban, not anything else. But he understood that he looked the way
yeah,
that he looked. There are some classic
yeah.
pictures from him. My favorites are the
In that
off-season.
era, the boxers, used to have that mentality, and I think that was one of the reasons why he kind of turned bodybuilding into a showboating thing, kind of like the way the fake wrestling is. The WWE turned, in the 90s and 2000s, the same thing, and he kind of made it into a show for the first time. And then Arnold, of course, made it even past that. And then Arnold turned his fame into movie stars. And then, as Mobster said, he took all his money, invested it in California real estate, which any idiot buys
Yeah,
California real estate in the 70s.
politics, Steve.
It's gonna
Dated a
make a lot of
Kennedy
money.
and governor of California twice.
Yep. So let's get into Primo and Anavar now. Why is Primo and Anavar relevant? Look, and at the end of the day, Primobolan was the number one steroid in the golden age. And let me go over why it was loved so much. So let's go over some of the things that Primobolan, what makes Primobolan special. So Primobolan, it's a dihydrotestosterone derivative. So the way the steroid was designed was from the DHT hormone. So it will not aromatize into estrogen. It will not do anything even structurally to bind to estrogen. So it competes with estrogen receptors in the body. So when these guys were going on Primobolan, their estrogen levels would drop. So and a lot of people today are scared. Oh my God, my estrogen levels are dropping. Blah blah blah. Did it affect their libido? Did it affect their ability to get erections? Probably. But at the end of the day, this is what they use going into competition. They didn't have a way to run testosterone with it to get their estrogen back up. The only option, they could run a handful of Dianabol, which they did. They would run a handful of Dianabol with it to kind of boost their estrogen back a little bit. But look, in those days, they were more worried about winning the competition and doing what they had to do. So Arnold is legendary. We know Arnold would run about 100 milligrams a day of the Primobolan. He would take an amp, pop it open, inject that 100 milligrams per day. Especially going into his competition, it would be something safe that you could use going into your competition. So if they did run some Dianabol with it, they would cut the Dianabol off, and then they'd go into the competition really hard and muscular, lean muscle mass. It wasn't something to blow you up, but it was something with very much muscle mass, and it would give you that type of yeah. So yeah, sorry guys. And look, sorry for that little delay. But look, at the end of the day, we got to make sure, when we are, you know, talking about this stuff that we understand why they did what they did. And it's very, very important to understand why they did what they did. And there was a method to the madness through trial and error. And if you were able to do the proper trial and error, you were able to be most successful. So, at the end of the day, Primobolan was the one that they really liked. And this is why, again, we talk about Gold's Gym. We talked about the golden era. We talk about, oh, it was related to money. Oh, no, it was related to because it was called Gold's Gym. Oh, no, it was related to the golden physiques, the start of bodybuilding, whatever you want to think that it was all about. Maybe it was a combination of all of them. But at the end of the day, Primobolan is the golden nectar of steroids. And Primobolan was very popular. It went away into the late 80s, into the 90s. Guys graduated to other steroids that would make them bigger, stronger, more muscular, faster. Primobolan's a slow builder. And then now it's sort of made a comeback, especially with our Aussie guys. The Aussie guys love Primobolan, absolutely love Primobolan. And also the price. It's one of the more expensive steroids. So that's another reason it kind of went away in because you can take equipoise for half the price. You can take another steroid for half the price and get more results. If you're talking about more muscle quicker, you can take testosterone, you can take DECA, you can take NPP. There's so many different steroids. Trenbolone, you can take Trenbolone, which is a third of the price, and blow up much quicker. Within 3 weeks, you'll develop, you'll blow up on Tren, and it'll take you 20 weeks to do the same on Primo. You see what I'm saying? So that's one of the reasons. But now guys are going back to Primo. They appreciate Primo, the low side effects, the lean quality muscle mass that it gives you, the patience has come back. And we see this trend. The 90s and 2000s, there was a lot less patience. Now people are going more toward, you know what? I want less side effects. I'm more willing to be patient. So we see these trends. It's just like styles. It's just like styles. I can remember in fifth grade, before I brought you Mobster, it was funny because for Christmas, you always got clothes, right, for Christmas. And you would go, and then when Christmas break was over from school, you start your second semester in January, and everyone would wear whatever outfits they got for Christmas. So guess what the style was when I was in fifth grade? It was suspenders. And I was so embarrassed to go to school with suspenders. I was like, man, I'm going to get made fun of. I'm the only guy wearing suspenders. Lo and behold, I show up and half the fucking boys were wearing suspenders. So it was the style of that particular season that came in. Now, that didn't seem to last long. I don't know why. Maybe a rapper was wearing suspenders around the time. Maybe it was Urkel. I don't know if it was Urkel on TV. I'm not sure when Family Matters started. I think it was actually later than that. But for some reason, Mobster, people were that was a style, but that did not last. It's like they wore it that one day and then no one ever wore it again. So obviously the boys didn't like the suspender, so it went out of style. Primo is one of those things. It was in style in the 70s, early 80s, went out of style because people found cheaper steroids that worked quicker, that worked faster, that gave them more growth. That's what they wanted. The 90s was growth, growth, growth. You go on the old EF forum of the 90s and then early 2000s, guys were all over tests. They were all over DECA. They were all over Anadrol. They wanted size, Superdrol. They wanted quick orals that worked fast. They didn't want to sit there for 12, 14 weeks and wait for Primo to start kicking in. So we've seen these trends come and go over time, and it seems like the trend is going more to Primo. And ironically, Primo is hard. Ironically, it's hard to find these days. because Primo has sort of kind of been out of stock lately, but it will be back in stock once we get through some of the difficulties we're going through. So you'll be able to get Primo from Geneza Pharma. You should be able to find it even when you're checking now. Go ahead, Monty.
I've looked, Steve, and they've got a Primo product right there with 100 milligrams. Look, guys, there's a couple of reasons, and I'll touch on one that Steve's already covered, but briefly. Availability of any kind of steroid was limited in the 70s. You're probably looking at 5 or 6 products. Evo was an obvious one. Some testosterone, little to no growth hormone, like Steve said, and so on. What you was also looking at, which probably came from the 50s and 60s, was you'd bulk up in the cold winter months when there were no competitions, and you would cut in the summer months. Now, arguably, Steve, it's easier to compete year round now. Possibility, an argument for the Australian forum members is that where they live is warm all the fucking time. So being in shape all the fucking time becomes a thing. So big thing for Primo that I've talked about on other shows is this. You have spent all winter getting as big as a house, add in 5 or 10 pounds of new tissue, some of which is fat, but hopefully the majority of which is muscle. Then when you dieted, especially then, Steve, your the thermogenic type products, cutting type products were minimal. And so Primo was used as it is now to hold onto your hard-earned muscle tissue. Yes, you can grow with it, but it requires patience and a great deal of Primo, and therefore a bit more money than various forms of testosterone. But back in the day, it was used for holding on to that 5 or 10 pounds of new tissue while you did cardio, while you ran up and down the beach, while you rode the bike, and cut, while you restricted your calories, so that you didn't lose more muscle than you wanted to. You might lose a little tiny bit cutting, but you wanted to make that the minimal amount of muscle loss and maximize fat loss. The reality now, as we've also talked about on other shows, Steve and I, is, and I've used this particular phrase, I shall use it again, you've never had it so good. Even in the year 2000, Muscle Media 2000 used to do articles, Steve, on John Romano, Dave Palumbo, and the other guys going over the border with Bill Phillips and buying steroids from the pharmacia. And it was very much of what they could get. One place would have 100 milligrams of X, another place with 200 milligrams of Y, and the fucking products were $120 a vial. You can now buy the same goddamn vial, Steve, for $50. And when we talk about approved sources, including Geneza, you can buy any fucking thing. We talk about peptides and SARMs and archibutol myostatin inhibitors. We talk about products that might be the next big thing. And the availability of those next big things is now, right this fucking minute. If you've got the bucks, you can pretty much get it. What have we talked about before, Steve? Even back in Arnold's time. Arnold and the other guys at Golds were lucky. They had a doctor down the block. And again, he would look after them and do the early versions of blood tests and make sure there weren't ever any problems. But most people bought that shit off the steroid dealer at the gym, goes to the trunk of his car, open up the trunk, open up his sports bag, see what he had. You bought what he had. You did not buy what you wanted. You can literally go to any of our approved sources, including Geneza, and you can buy all the steroids that are possible for bodybuilding, all of the ancillaries that are required to help you on your cycle, all of the thermogenics that you might need, the cutting products, the clenbuterol, all of that. Back in the 70s, was next to zero. It was like options 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was it. And you were paying 2 times, probably 3 or 4 times the equivalent price, allowing for inflation and whatever else on how much you was earning versus how much you spent on steroids. It's probably 4 times the price. So it's cheaper now. It's more valuable now. And even Primo, which has, as Steve said, been a little bit short stocked in terms of material coming for the Raws, it started to make an appearance. And what we've seen, even this week, Steve, when I do pre-show research, as Steve does, and we see what's out there on the forums and questions that are being asked, you are seeing more and more Americans, and especially, as Steve said, Australians, putting Primo in. I think the only issue, and I will say this in terms of expectations on this cycle, on this fact that we're talking about today, is that some people will run 1,000 milligrams of Primo and say, I didn't get that big. I only added 4 pounds of muscle. Yeah, that's kind of the point, guys. If you want to use tren, if you want to use debulk, if you want to use some bulking steroid, and you want to get as big as a house, Primo Anavar is not your stack of choice. If you want to get cut, you want to get lean, you want to hold on to muscle tissue, then a Primo and Anavar stack, and I said this to Steve in a pre-show, is nigh on fucking perfect. I like it. Let me list very briefly what I would expect, Steve. Retention of muscle tissue while I'm dieting and restricting my calories and increasing my cardio. So I get cuts. I start to get leaner. Pumps from the Anavar, good and bad pumps, but we'll get to that. A hardness to my physique, the appearance of a lean, muscular look, which definitely appeals to our Australian buddies and to a great many more people than it used to. Some lean mass gain, specifically associated with your training and your diet, and obviously the dosages. But I would expect 4 to 5 pounds of lean muscle mass added to my frame if that's the way that I was training. I wouldn't expect 15 or 20 pounds. But 3, 4, 5 pounds would be amazing. And for my own purposes, and I've talked about this with Anavar, a little bit of an increase in strength. So you're losing some fatty tissue, so a little bit of water, and yet you're either retaining the strength that you've already got, or in my case, who's not trying to get lean, I'm increasing my strength. So the idea that I could stay as strong and look more muscular and be harder and literally have that aesthetic look. Not every single person that trains on the forums, on you listen to this show, you're not all looking for 20-inch arms. Some of you just want to look damn good in a shirt, damn good down the club, damn good in a pair of trunks on the beach. They want that little V thing going into the waist. They want to look like someone who might model. They definitely want to look like someone who trained. And for me, this stack, I phrase the question is why this stack is still relevant. I think this stack is still relevant because you're keeping the hard-earned muscle tissue that you spent years. You're getting to look real good. You're maintaining that level of strength. It's almost, Steve, if that's your thing, and I would hope that the person listening to the show is exactly your thing, it's almost a perfect stack. And I would argue against Steve, with the possible exception of the Anavar pumps, and dose dependent, obviously, the side effects ain't that brutal. Literally the Anavar pumps and using orals for a length of time. And we're going to get into cycling and stacking, etc. briefly. It would be the how long I would want to run Primo for, which would arguably, Steve, be longer than the Anavar. Anavar being an oral, I would want to run less time. If I could, and this is more for the listeners' benefit than my own specific requirements, if I could, I'd want to run them both for the same length of time. A quick question, and we will talk about stacks and cycling, of course, using Geneza products. How long would you run Primo for to get cutting into shape versus how long would you run Anavar? And would you arguably push it to 12 weeks because of the combination versus what we would normally say was 4 to 8 weeks for the VAR on its own? Just as a quick question, Steve.
Well, the problem with Anavar, even though it has low side effects, is that it is liver toxic. And look, all anabolic steroids are liver toxic in a way. Some, obviously, there's a big range. Some are very, very low liver toxicity. Of course, it depends on the dosing that you're using. But if you're going to use the Anavar, we're going to talk about dosing as well. In the next segment, I kind of want to save it for that. But um, when it comes to oral steroids, 8 weeks maximum is probably going to be your best bet. So in this situation, you want to build that golden era physique. What you would probably want to do is use the Anavar the last 8 weeks of your cycle. So the Primo, it's got an enanthate ester. You're going to want to run it, from week 1, and you're going to want to run it and be patient with it. It will take about 40 to 50 days to reach peak concentration in your system if you're injecting in on a correct schedule, once or twice a week injections. Of course, you can microdose it. Arnold used to microdose it. He was using 100 milligram amps and, pinning, twice a week, having to pin 3 or 4 cc's twice a week was a little bit of a pain. They didn't like injecting in those days. And a lot of us today don't like injecting either. So, you'd rather just do 1 cc a day and it's a lot easier than having to load up a 3 cc syringe and try to do the whole thing, and that's a lot of oil to be going into your muscle. So the bottom line is, especially with Primobolan over the years, it's had a lot of post-injection pain. Now, Geneza Pharma Primobolan, they do a great job with post-injection pain with the Primo to limit it. So a really good trick would be to mix it with another oil. And you should be doing that. You should be mixing your oils as well. So if you're running a little testosterone, like I said, we're going to get into that in a second on the next segment on how to dose and how to use. But let me talk about a little bit about Anavar now, Mobster. I know you touched on it a bit. So Anavar also number one oral steroid. And it was the number one oral steroid, I would say, all the way up to the steroid banning that we had going into the 90s. After they banned steroids, Anavar's price absolutely skyrocketed. There was such high demand for it, and so few Anavar out there. People who were smart enough to stock up on it before the ban, they were able to sell it for 3, 4, 5 times the price because there was so much demand. Because think about it, what other steroid did they have access to in those days that they trusted and that they could take as an oral and that gave that type of result where when the hardening benefits, the body fat benefits, there are some body fat loss benefits as well with Anavar. That it was slim pickings. And Proviron, yes, it provides that, but not as good as Anavar. Proviron is one of those, is a very, very weak steroid. Like if you run Proviron by itself, it's not going to do much of anything except maybe harden you up a little bit, and help your libido maybe if you react good to DHTs. But Anavar, it works fantastic solo. It works fantastic stacked. So the price skyrocketed. The price even to this day was very, very high. I can remember in the 2000s, even going into the 2010s, I couldn't even afford to run a cycle of Anavar. But now, because of Geneza Pharma, they've done a great job of price point, and they make Anavar affordable. Now you can, a normal working class blue collar guy can, or a female, because females can use Anavar as well. You can go buy Anavar today and afford it to run a cycle of it for 6 to 8 weeks. So great stack together. So why don't we talk about Mobster? Let's get into specific dosing on using Anavar and using Primo. And why don't we
Yeah.
talk about that? And you want me to start on that?
Well, I was just going to
All right,
say,
go ahead. Yeah.
let's discuss individually, and then let's talk about as a stack. So I'll start with the Anavar. Regular listeners to these shows know that Anavar is right up there in terms of being one of my favorite oral steroids to use, and especially for the strength enhancement when I'm training specifically for that in my training. And what would I be looking at here, Steve? I've done 8 week cycles in the past, but my preference right now, and for the last couple of years, is to keep it kind of short. I've argued about toxicity before on a like for like basis, etc., etc. But in simple terms, and without going too deep down that rabbit hole, 4 to 8 weeks of Anavar run solo between 30 to 50 milligrams per day. Now, I also agree, because we touched upon that already, with Steve's idea, which would be to run the Primo for 12 weeks. And we'll talk about Primo dose, and I'll bring Steve in for that, and especially the combination. And I would probably go with Steve's suggestion, which would be dieting and conditioning work to get cut pre-cycle, then a 12-week cycle of Primo run at dosages that we'll debate shortly, and the latter 8 weeks, 4 weeks. And that would also depend on my conditions, Steve. So don't get too out of shape to begin with, guys. Hence, we talk about preconditioning work. Don't rely too much on the products. Do the cardio work hard with your knife and fork. So what would be your suggestions on Primo on its own? And we've seen 1,000 milligrams a week,
Yep.
not unusual, Steve. What about that on its own, and then obviously in combination with Anavar and how you'd run it?
Yeah, so don't forget too with females. Females can run Anavar as well. So 2.5 to 10 milligrams would be the dose with Anavar, and I like that with the Anavar. I run Anavar at 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, up to 50. I know that back in the day, guys would run even more. They'd run 70, 80, 100. I know one guy, I remember he used to run 120 milligrams of Anavar. He was crazy. But you gotta remember, in those days, they were getting low quality Anavar. So sometimes you'll see guys who are dosing really, really high amounts. You got to remember, Geneza Pharma Anavar is the real deal. We're talking 98, 99% purity. It's not some underdose crap that's like 30, 40%. This is 98, 99%. So you don't have to run it.
Just to interrupt very briefly, and I have talked about this before. I have seen in the latter 2 weeks of a competition cycle, Steve, when you're super lean and your calories are very restricted, and this is literally for guys getting ready for stage, exactly as Steve just said. And this applies to D-Bowl, never mind Anavar, but specifically for stage prep, 100 milligrams per day in the last week. But I would literally only do that if I was going to go on stage and wanted a trophy. This is not for guys that are looking to get in shape. Back to you, Steve.
So with Primo, I would go anywhere from 300 to 600 milligrams a week. I know there's some guys on the forum, they'll run it lower. I've seen 150, 200, 250, but I really think 300 to 600, especially if you're, just running it with the Anavar, would be a great stack. Now, you could also look into the Geneza Pharma testosterone options. A lot of you out there, you like to run testosterone as your base. Got to remember, in the golden age, we're talking about golden age here. In the golden age, they did not run testosterone, guys. They did not. So if you really want to copycat the golden age stack, you're not going to run testosterone. A lot of people out there are going to argue this. They're going to comment, which is fine. They're going to say, "Oh, you got to run testosterone as your base. You got to." Look, they didn't. They didn't. 70s, 80s, they did not run testosterone. Testosterone didn't really start getting ran in cycles till the late 80s, very late 80s, when they started to realize they could run testosterone on a cycle and stack Novodex with it as an anti-estrogen, which is not a good option. Now we use aromatase inhibitors, the aromacins and the 8X. But anyway, my point is, if you want to throw in testosterone, throw in a little testosterone, but you don't want to ruin the cycle by running a ton of testosterone with Primo and Anavar, because now you're defeating the purpose of the golden age look. You want that nice tight waist, that hardening, that vascularity. Look at the pictures of the Sergey Oliva. Look at the pictures of the Arnold. Look at the picture of the Frank Zane. These are the guys, when they're flexing, you got those striations right in the middle of your chest. Your low body fat, low body fat. This is what they strive for. So if you want to do that, try just Primo and Anavar. Try the stack. Give it a shot for a cycle. Do 12 weeks of Primo and then do 8 weeks of the Anavar, the last 8 weeks of that cycle. Try it, without testosterone, and see what ends up happening. How dry you get, how ripped you get,
Steve, I
how
mean,
hard
look,
you get.
just let me do the thing that Steve just said visually. I'm thinking specifically, Steve, here of Serge Nubret, who's in the Pumping Iron movie. Him, Arnold, and Lou Ferrigno are the top three in the Pumping Iron movie, aka the Black Panther, I think from French Guadeloupe. I might be mispronouncing that. A tiny fucking waist. Steve's just touched upon that. Arnold did that thing of bringing his waist in and making it look like it was tiny. So imagine this look, guys, with tension of muscle tissue, little bit of veins, looking like a muscular male model with a tiny, tiny fucking waist. Women, and to men that are sexually attracted to men will talk about how the freaky look is too much. But if you show them pictures of these guys with these muscles, muscular shoulders, muscular arms, a beginning of a six pack, a little bit of veins, and a tiny fucking waist, it's almost cartoonish, but it grabs people's attention. And if that's your bag, this is what we're talking about today. The idea that you could potentially look like that physique. It's an aesthetic. It's where the classic physique class came from. And why is the classic physique class growing? Why has C-Bun got, what is it now, Steve, 20 million fucking followers on Instagram? More than any other top professional bodybuilder right now. The man that wins the classic class, just retired, might return as a pro, who the fuck knows, as an open class bodybuilder, who knows. More followers for the guy in a quote unquote lesser class, because that look, that idea, that visual in your mind as you listen to the show should grab your attention and go, that's how I want to look. Big Ram is great. Lou Ferrigno back in the days, the monster's great. Dorian Yates as a monster's great. But what I want to look like is what Steve and Mobs are talking about. That tiny waist, the beginnings of a six pack, a vein on my arm, and people going, what the fuck is that walking down the beach, Steve? In my shirt, in my trousers, going to the club, going to the bar, going to meet the guys for a round of golf. and looking like something that's dropped out of the fucking heavens and landed on planet Earth. See, it's got to be a visual that captures people's imagination. Back to you.
All right, all right. I think it's I think that sums it up, guys. Now there's some other steroids, that you could throw in here. You can, if you really wanted to copy, what they were doing, you could kickstart the cycle with a handful of Dianabol every day, but not much. I would do maybe 10 or 20 milligrams, and Geneza Pharma also has Dianabol, so that would be an option if you wanted to give the cycle a little bit of a kick, you know. You could go that way, and then you could do the first, let's say the first 3 or 4 weeks with Dianabol, take a couple weeks off, and then start your Anavar, and then keep, run the Primo from step one. That's another option as well. But again, it's just not necessary. So if you want to copy what they were doing in the 70s and do that Primo Anavar stack, that would be ideal. So let's get into Geneza Pharma quality, and I talked about a little bit about the Primobolan. And let me remind you again, Primobolan over the years, I've used different Primobolan over the years. Stuff can be absolutely nasty when it comes to post-injection pain. So Geneza Pharma has done an absolutely fantastic job of making sure that it does not have that issue. And you're able to run the Geneza Pharma without having soreness basically after you inject it, or pain after injecting. I've run the Bear Primo, pharmaceutical Bear Primo before, and I can remember after I injected that, I was on the ground in pain because it hurt so much. It feels like you just got stabbed. Okay, so Geneza Pharma does a really really good job. You gotta love that. You gotta love their Anavar, high quality. These are two of the most fake steroids out there, guys. And you've just got to be careful when it comes to using them because they're expensive. And sources, what they like to do, in brands, what they like to do is they like to cheat you. So what we've seen over the years is you buy the Anavar, instead of actually having Anavar, they're selling you Winstrol instead of, or they'll sell you Turinabol, which are cheaper steroids to produce, and then they rip you off that way. Or instead of selling you Primo, this was a big thing in the 90s. They would send you Deca instead. So it was really really bad over the years. And back then, brands and sources knew that you were stupid. And it's not that you were stupid, maybe I shouldn't use that word, it's that you had no way to prove that what you got was fake. Today you can send things out to an actual lab and they can test it and tell you exactly what's in the product. So now you're not going to be able to play those games. So Geneza Pharma products are routinely sent off to be tested anonymously, and we have guys on the forum that actually do this to try to see, are they trying to pull something. And every time they send it off, we're talking about 98.5% to 99.7% pure Anavar, pure Primo. So you can be rest assured when you buy Geneza Pharma, you're getting high quality Primo and Anavar. Your hard-earned dollars,
Yeah.
you guys, all that, most of you out there are like me and Mobster. You're not trust fund babies. You work hard for your money, right? You want to spend your money on something you're getting good value for. So that's what we want to make sure that we get.
Absolutely, Steve. I mean, look, the idea that we were going to do this very show to talk about these Geneza products with you is literally 2 days old. 3 days ago, I was reading Geneza Pharma reviews on the forum, and it was completely unsolicited, came up there. So we talk about companies like Geneza Pharma, and we ask why we have what we have and the access that we've got to these products, which I mentioned already. And Steve's talked about it. So when I see people, unsolicited reviews, Steve, completely random, got nothing to do with this show coming out, and someone says, I've just bought Geneza Pharma products from one of the big name resellers, and I'm absolutely fucking loving the results. And this is how companies, I'm talking about the post-injection thing that Steve mentioned. I've been around the game long enough, never mind the iron game history, physical culture, golden age stuff, just the anabolic steroid stuff, and seeing the developments in accessibility and quality and so on and so forth. So, for example, when I first started looking at steroids, the whole issue with bad injections was still a thing. And you will see this horrendous pictures on the forums. The issue of Steve said with normal dose products, never mind high dose products, normal dose products with post injection pain if the alcohol ratio, oil was poor quality, and so on and so forth. And people, oh my God, that last injection, I've got an abscess, I've got a swelling, I've got an infection, the bump won't go down. Da, 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 da. We don't see those things anymore. I think maybe once or twice a year someone has a bad jab. Once or twice a year they've chosen to use a 400 or 500 milligrams per mil product, and they might, even now you don't see that at the regular level of frequency. So all companies, but specifically Geneza Pharma, the quality has gone up. And the main reason for this, Steve, is it makes no sense for me, if I'm supplying you product, Geneza Pharma, in my shoes, to supply you a product that hurts, to supply you a product that's poor quality, to supply you a product that doesn't have what it says on the fucking label. You do not get to stay in business and provide solid products that work for you if you diet hard, if you train hard, and then you spend $500, $600, $1,000 on your stack. It does not make sense beyond getting your money one time for me to give you poor products. I want you to buy my products again and again and again. I want you to recommend my products. So like I said with that review was literally someone has gone on. I've seen you guys talk about Geneza on the podcast. I went to the big name reseller and boom, I bought Geneza and I'm getting great. I'm 4 pounds of muscle up, Steve. My waist has gone down. I'm starting to look good. Let us know what you think, guys. Is this old school stack something you use? Is Primo making a comeback? Could you get good results from it? Have we inspired you to go for that look? Make sure you come to the forum, log your results, let people know if you've had good results from Geneza, let people know about the show, let people know that if you've tried the Primo and Anavar stack and you look fucking amazing. That would be great, guys. Thank you very much. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours. It is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.